This is the first time in my life farming that I still have crop in my bins that I can't sell.
Talk to America's farmers. They'll tell you these are tough times. A combination of high operating costs, low commodity prices, and lost markets has had devastating repercussions on the agriculture industry and the communities built around it. CBS's Lana Zach is in Davenport, Iowa tonight with new details on the growing crisis.
Farmers say this has been a perfect storm. They were already battling higher growing costs and crop disease. And
American farmers aren't quitting. They're dying. We lose more than 300 farmers to suicide every single year in the United States. That's more than double the national average. Not because they fail, but because the system is designed to crush them.
It's awful discouraging. You know, we do our very best to grow a good crop to feed the world, and then we can't hardly give it.
We're just absolutely fucked as farmers, guys. Everything is so fucked, and I do not see anybody surviving this farm crisis that we're in.
Something unbelievable is happening in global agriculture, a shift so strange, so unexpected, that most analysts dismissed the early signs as a joke. Garlic, a crop the world barely paid attention to, a crop associated with kitchens, not geopolitics, a crop no one imagined could disrupt a superpower until Africa quietly turned it into a $140 billion weapon of economic strategy. While America was focusing on soybeans, corn, and wheat, Africa rewrote the rules of global food markets using one of the simplest, most underestimated crops on Earth. And the moment the numbers hit Washington, alarms lit up across the entire agricultural sector, because nothing about this move was accidental. It was precise, timed, strategic, and devastating. This story begins with a crisis no one saw coming. For decades, the U.S. controlled Africa's garlic demand almost by default. The continent imported massive volumes, paying premium prices, while American producers enjoyed a near-guaranteed market. No competition, no threat, no alternative. But on the ground in Africa, farmers saw something different. They saw empty land, perfect climate conditions, rising demand, soaring prices, and a foreign dependency that made no sense. Garlic was cheap to grow, expensive to import, and required almost no advanced machinery. Yet Africa was spending billions to buy something it could easily produce. The imbalance was absurd, and then everything flipped. A wave of agricultural reforms swept through East, West, and Southern Africa. Farmland cooperatives emerged from regions once dismissed as unproductive. Solar-powered irrigation arrived where water scarcity used to be the biggest barrier. Hybrid seed varieties multiplied yields. Local processing plants began turning raw garlic into powders, oils, pastes, extracts higher-value products with global markets. What began as small, scattered experiments turned into a continental boom. Yields multiplied, imports collapsed, local production surged. Suddenly Africa wasn't just feeding itself, it was exporting. And not small-scale exports, massive, record-setting quantities flowing into the Middle East, South Asia, and parts of Europe looking for cheaper suppliers. The numbers were shocking. Every new metric pushed Africa further up the global rankings. Every shipment disrupted old trade patterns, and every lost contract hit America harder than anyone expected. This wasn't just new competition. This was a full-on takeover. By the time Washington realized Africa had created a $140 billion garlic economy, it was already too late. U.S. producers were losing buyers. Prices were collapsing. Storage facilities were overflowing with unsold stock. Export projections fell off a cliff, and yet the most stunning part wasn't Africa's rise, it was the way it happened. Africa didn't win because it was cheap, it won because it innovated. While American farmers struggled with rising labor costs, strict pesticide rules, and expensive land, African farmers used vertical farming, drip irrigation, low-cost labor, and regionally adapted seed strains to dominate the market at a fraction of the price. And while American companies debated subsidies, African producers formed regional alliances and cross-border agricultural corridors that made distribution faster and cheaper. This wasn't coincidence. This was coordination. Agricultural ministers across multiple regions streamlined export procedures, ports upgraded, cold storage expanded. Highways connected farms to international trade routes, investors poured in, land was leased, contracts were standardized, and production scaled to a level that global buyers couldn't ignore. What happened next shocked the industry. Major importers signed multi-year garlic supply deals across Africa, deals worth not millions, but billions, over $140 billion in long-term commitments. And overnight, the US found itself cut out of markets it once dominated. The shock in Washington wasn't just about money, it was about influence. Garlic may not sound like a geopolitical weapon, but food dependency always translates to power. When you control the supply, you control the pricing. When you control the pricing, you control the market. And when you control the market, you control the narrative. Africa had flipped the script. For decades, Western nations warned Africa about food insecurity. Now African nations were dictating prices in a sector they were never expected to compete in. Nations once dependent on imports were now setting global export trends. The imbalance had reversed. Global commodity analysts scrambled to model the shift. Economists called it a quiet revolution. But inside agricultural boards across America, the mood was panic. Because nobody saw this coming. Not this crop, not this scale, not this fast. The US wasn't just outperformed, it was blindsided. And the ripple effects were brutal. American garlic farms faced layoffs, land devaluations, and supply gluts that crushed profits. Exporters warned that the US was losing ground in one commodity after another. And policymakers realized that Africa was no longer the emerging player. It was becoming a global powerhouse in agricultural strategy, using land, climate, and innovation to outperform established giants. Africa's $140 billion garlic power move wasn't a fluke, it was a signal, a sign that Africa has entered a new era, an era where the continent isn't competing for survival but competing for dominance. An era where agricultural decisions can shake global markets. An era where the world's most underestimated regions are rewriting economic history. This isn't a story about garlic, it's a story about power, a story about how Africa turned a humble crop into a geopolitical tool, a story about how a continent long sidelined became a central player in global food economics, a story about how the world's largest economy was caught off guard by one of the smallest crops. And if this is what Africa can do with garlic, imagine what happens when the next commodity shifts. This is just the beginning. The moment the announcement hit international markets, a strange silence fell across the global agricultural world, a silence that felt too heavy to be accidental. It wasn't just a trade shift. It was a power realignment. Africa's garlic surge, once dismissed as nothing more than a bold experiment, had swelled into a tidal force that nobody in Washington believed could ever materialize. And now that it had, the disbelief had turned into something sharper: panic. Behind closed doors across different continents, analysts scrambled through charts, maps, and projections that no longer made sense. Bills, policies, and long-standing trade agreements suddenly felt outdated, like relics from an era that had expired overnight. The numbers coming out of Africa weren't just impressive, they were historic. Fields once considered too dry, too remote, too underfunded were now yielding outputs on a scale that rivaled global giants. Every report hinted at the same truth: Africa's garlic boom wasn't an accident. It was planned, structured, engineered to cut deep into markets that had gone unquestioned for decades. The shock wasn't only that Africa had grown enough garlic to disrupt supply chains, it was how fast it happened. America's top producers, used to dominating headlines and setting global prices, watched as their command slipped like sand through open fingers. Shipments destined for Africa sat idle, unsigned contracts stacked like unanswered questions. Buyers who once relied heavily on U.S. suppliers pivoted sharply toward Africa's expanding network, attracted by lower costs, fresher yields, and a bold new energy that promised independence from foreign economic grip. What unsettled Washington wasn't the numbers, it was the symbolism. Africa had chosen to lead, and the world was watching. Farmers across the U.S. heartland began to feel the pressure first. Their projections darkened, warehouses filled faster than they emptied. For years, they had been reassured that Africa could never truly compete on a scale that mattered, that its agricultural infrastructure wasn't ready, that its logistics were fragile, that its governments lacked cohesion, but those assumptions were now floating in the ruins of overconfidence. Africa had built something new, something collective, efficient, and unstoppable. What made it even more electrifying was the raw defiance behind it. This wasn't just business. It was strategy. A move meant to shift leverage away from Western hands that had controlled food narratives for generations. Garlic was simply the symbol: sharp, resilient, impossible to ignore. The continent's cooperatives had united in a way the world had never imagined. Cross-border agricultural corridors connected farmers with exporters. Digital systems linked rural growers to international buyers. Solar-powered irrigation transformed barren lands into green oceans of potential. A new generation of agritech innovators had rewritten Africa's farming model, not by copying Western techniques, but by designing systems tailored for Africa's climate, soil, and economic realities. And at the center of it all stood the quiet fury of history, decades of being underestimated, decades of being framed as dependent, decades of being told what to grow, how to grow it, and whom to sell it to. Now, suddenly, the dependency had reversed. In the U.S., media outlets cautiously began to address the crisis. Headlines shifted from confident dismissal to urgent concern. Unexpected African expansion, some called it sudden market shock, others warned. But behind every headline was the same uneasy truth. America had been caught sleeping, the biggest question echoing through Washington was, how? How did 54 nations, often portrayed as too divided, pull off a coordinated agricultural revolution? How had a crop they barely paid attention to become a global headline capable of rattling one of the world's most powerful economies? But the answer lay far from politics and intelligence assessments. It began in the soil-rich, untouched, underestimated soil, land that American investors once passed over because it didn't fit their models or their timelines. Land that Africans knew intimately and respected deeply. Land that responded not to outside expectations but to the hands of those who had cultivated it for centuries. Africa's garlic boom was built on something Western analysts never factor into their equations: a collective hunger for sovereignty. It wasn't about garlic, it was about control, economic control, narrative control, future control. And every successful harvest sent shockwaves through markets that had built entire empires on the assumption that Africa would never compete, that Africa would always be the buyer, never the seller, the importer, never the exporter, the follower, never the disruptor. But the numbers didn't lie. African garlic was flooding regional markets. Global buyers were sending inquiries faster than exporters could respond. Demand was skyrocketing because Africa wasn't just producing more, it was producing better. The unique soil profiles gave African garlic a potency, a density, a flavor that stunned culinary markets across the Middle East and Asia. Suddenly, buyers who once paid top dollar for American produce were turning their attention southward. Logistics companies in the U.S. began reporting massive slowdowns. Ports processed fewer outbound agricultural shipments, cold storage facilities grew crowded, and Wall Street analysts began whispering about long-term implications, talks of price collapses, supply gluts, and policy vulnerabilities. What Washington feared most wasn't the economic hit, it was the precedent. If Africa could dominate garlic, what would stop it from taking over ginger, onions, tomatoes, coffee, cocoa, cashews? What if garlic was only the beginning of a continental transformation? What if Africa's agricultural awakening rippled into energy, minerals, manufacturing? One industry leader quietly admitted what many were thinking: if they can do this with garlic, we're in trouble. But Africa wasn't slowing down. The continent pushed forward with a kind of determination that felt almost cinematic: bold, unified, and unafraid. The world had changed. The power lines had shifted, and each new shipment exported from African ports carried more than produce. It carried a message. Africa doesn't need permission to rise. The shockwaves spreading across the U.S. were only the beginning. Analysts predicted that the garlic market would never look the same again. Africa had done the unthinkable. It had taken a crop that nobody believed could change global dynamics and used it as a weapon to break decades-old assumptions. And as America tried to understand how it lost control so fast, Africa moved with quiet confidence, unbothered by the noise, because for the first time in a long time, the continent was not reacting, it was leading. And the world had no choice but to adjust.